Would you mind explaining to us how you got interested in the national debt and specifically the time period you're going to be speaking about?
Yes, so I initially got interested in economics in order to understand why some countries were thriving while others remained in poverty. And this was a very personal interest of mine because I grew up in Germany, which I would put at the time in the thriving category. My relatives came from southern Italy, and visiting there as a child, I just saw such a stark contrast with Germany. We had paved roads, it was clean, there were no animals that you would consider pets just running around outside freely, and that's what I experienced visiting Italy. So that's where my initial interest came from. I got into fiscal policy because it is the foundational structure of a strong economy, is that you have a government that lives within its limits, that provides for the limited public goods that governments are best made for, such as national defense and the rule of law, but that otherwise interferes minimally in the affairs of its citizens. That's the basis of a strong economy that allows individuals and families and communities to flourish, and allows for the economic growth that increases living standards, life expectancies, and all the good things we like to enjoy. And fiscal policy plays such an important role in those components, but it's also that governments tend to face incentives to want to expand their size and scope, which is where checks and balances come in and are so important. And the most important check on politicians' propensity to want to especially use deficits to expand the size and scope of government is an informed citizenry, as well as limits such as constitutional limits, like a balanced budget amendment, for example. I tend to follow this school of the late James Buchanan on that front, that democracies have a propensity to use deficits because it is politically unpopular to raise taxes, and it's politically very popular to increase benefits. And so that's the scenario we're facing in the United States now, where the biggest benefit programs, Medicare and Social Security, are growing rapidly without the economic or revenue resources to fund these programs. And under current projections, we will face a debt crisis likely over the next 10 to 15 years if we don't change the fiscal course. Just last week, the government put out the financial report of the United States government. It's a Treasury report that looks at 75-year unfunded obligations, the gap between what the government will collect in taxes and what it has promised to spend. And that gap, now more than 100%, and I'll say why it's more than 100%, is due to Medicare and Social Security. It's more than 100% because the non-entitlement portion of the budget is actually going to run a small surplus that reduces the unfunded obligation from Medicare and Social Security slightly. And so those are the challenges that we face and that we must address so we can preserve the vibrancy and the economic and individual freedom we enjoy here in the United States.
And thinking about the history of President Coolidge's budgetary and monetary policy, what is a lesson that America can learn today from his approach to fiscal policy?
Yeah, President Coolidge was the last president that actually reduced government spending. We have had surpluses since then, especially during the Clinton administration, but those were more by a coincidence because the economy was growing rapidly, and we also had a surplus in Social Security due to demographic and timing reasons, which obviously is not the case anymore. But President Coolidge actually reduced government spending. Since then, it's only gone up year after year. And I think that concept, that especially after crises, as our nation emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic and the excessive government spending that was fueled in large part by Federal Reserve policies and the inflation that we have seen as a result, now would be the time to heed the lessons of President Coolidge and actually reduce government spending. It would be a boon to the economy, unlike what many want to claim, that reducing deficits always is bad for growth. Actually, the opposite is the case when you have excessive government spending and deficits that are too high. And we have those now. We have deficits in excess of $2 trillion annually as a percentage of GDP. That's almost 7% of GDP, which is a deficit that in U.S. history we've only ever seen during financial or other like natural crises and wars. And we are now running those deficits during relative peace times due to structural imbalances having to do primarily with the growth in old age benefits, Medicare and Social Security.
Absolutely. If there's one point you want people to take away from this conference today, either from your talk later this afternoon or from the presentations that have already been given, what is that?
Yeah, I would say that that a responsible fiscal policy is a foundational element of a strong economy and a strong national security, and that the United States has had a long history of honoring its debts and living within its means, and we should go back to those Hamiltonian norms of preserving the credit and the credibility of the United States government for the long term, because our economic and national security depends on running a responsible federal budget.
And what do you see as the quickest path towards restoring those Hamiltonian norms?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest challenge that we face, because in particular in the 1950s, John Maynard Keynes changed the cultural norm around living within your means by convincing politicians that deficits can be a good thing. Now, if you look at the actual lessons that Keynes was sharing, the idea was that during times of relative economic weakness, when the economy is not at its potential, the argument is that you could use deficits to get closer to that potential, and as such, deficits could be a good thing during such times of crises. But the way that Congress has been practicing this policy is in a more politically convenient fashion of deficits are always a good thing. And that's clearly not the case. You can rely more on deficits when you're in an economically weak time or during a financial crisis, or like we saw during the pandemic, but then you're supposed to be paying those down and reducing those deficits and running surpluses in order to make up for that in future years. And that's where, that is what's not happening. So with that in mind, also given that most of the programs that are driving us deeper into debt are running on autopilot, Congress doesn't actually vote on these programs on an annual basis, so there isn't a functioning budget process to truly debate the key drivers of our debt. So we need a different mechanism to address these programs, also recognizing the political realities that it's very difficult to reform Medicare and Social Security, which is why I'm a proponent of a fiscal commission, in particular one that's modeled after the successful Base Realignment and Closure Commission. That was a commission that the executive established after the Cold War in order to close obsolete military bases that were weighing down the U.S. defense budget, another politically tricky subject. And the commission was able to get around the political obstacles to closing those military bases. And I think we need a similar approach to reforming Medicare and Social Security, with the key aspects of a BRAC-like fiscal commission being that you want more independent experts on the commission, so you can give members of Congress both the information and wisdom, what needs to be changed, but also political cover, so they can refer to the experts that came up with the specific proposals. And then the second part that was so critical to the success of the Base Realignment and Closure Commission was that the commission's recommendation would go into law by default, so that Congress didn't have to affirmatively vote to close military bases. They did have an expedited procedure available to reject the closure of military bases, but they didn't have to go on the record in support. And I think that was key. And given the difficulty of reforming Medicare and Social Security, and this primarily being a political problem, I think that political cover a Brack-like commission could give Congress by allowing for the commission recommendations to go into effect by default, with Congress retaining the option to reject the proposal, would be key to allowing members of Congress to be advocates for their community and the interests of their constituents, while at the same time making economically necessary but politically difficult decisions and allowing those commission recommendations to go into effect.
That's extremely insightful. Thank you for the opportunity to interview you and for you being present here with us today at this conference at the Library of Congress. We're looking forward to your panel later today.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.